Why did Lady Day fall for men who hurt her? Billie Holiday's love life was a devastating pattern. Abusive partners, toxic relationships, and self-destructive choices. Jimmy Monroe, Joe Guy, John Levy, and McKay. They all sabotaged her career and fed her addiction. But this wasn't just bad luck. Psychologists today recognize this pattern as trauma bonding. And Billie Holiday's childhood experiences had created the perfect storm for this type of destructive romantic attraction. Today I'm going to tell you this tragic love story and explain why a brilliant artist consistently chose men who would destroy her. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel because in the coming weeks we'll be sharing the toxic relationships of other legendary artists and the psychological patterns behind self-destructive behaviors. Billie Holiday's first serious adult relationship started with Jimmy Monroe in 1941 and immediately established the pattern that would dominate her entire love life. Monroe was a small-time drug dealer who operated in the Harlem jazz scene, but his real talent was manipulation and exploitation. When they first met at Small's Paradise nightclub, Billie was already an established star earning substantial income from recordings and performances. But Monroe immediately recognized the vulnerability behind her confident stage persona and systematically began the process of emotional manipulation that would characterize all her subsequent romantic relationships. Jimmy Monroe's psychological profile was that of a classic abuser, charming surface personality that concealed a controlling and exploitative nature. He presented himself as a protector and manager, offering to handle her business affairs and shield her from industry pressures. This protective facade appealed to Billie because her childhood experiences had created a deep need for male protection and validation. Her biological father, Clarence Holiday, had abandoned the family when she was an infant, leaving her with no model for healthy masculine relationships. This abandonment created a psychological wound that made her susceptible to men who promised security while actually providing the opposite. This first relationship established dynamics that would repeat throughout her life. Monroe quickly gained control over her finances, claiming he was protecting her money from industry exploitation. In reality, he diverted significant portions of her earnings to support his drug-dealing operations and personal expenses. When Billie questioned these financial arrangements, Monroe employed emotional manipulation techniques that childhood trauma survivors often find irresistible, alternating between excessive affection and calculated withdrawal of approval. Monroe also introduced Billie to regular heroin use, claiming it would help manage her performance anxiety and emotional stress. This wasn't a coincidence. Drug dealers often target vulnerable individuals precisely because addiction creates dependency beyond just chemical. For trauma survivors like Billie, drugs provide temporary relief from psychological pain while simultaneously creating a new form of control by the dealer partner. This pattern continued throughout all her relationships, where romantic partners invariably became her primary drug suppliers. The psychological foundation for these destructive patterns was rooted in her childhood experiences in Baltimore. Born Eleonora Fagan, she endured sexual abuse at a young age, witnessed her mother's struggles with poverty and absent men, and experienced multiple abandonments by father figures. These early traumas created an attachment style that psychologists term anxious disorganized, where an individual simultaneously craves intimacy and expects betrayal. This internal contradiction makes healthy relationships feel uncomfortable and unfamiliar, while toxic relationships feel normal and even comforting because they confirm existing beliefs about love and pain being connected. Specific details of her childhood trauma provide crucial context for understanding adult relationship patterns. At age 10, she was sexually assaulted by a neighbor, a traumatic experience that her mother initially refused to believe. This betrayal by her primary caregiver created a dual wound: the trauma of the assault itself and the devastating realization that those supposed to protect her might not be reliable. Her biological father Clarence Holiday's abandonment occurred when she was an infant, but his sporadic reappearances created an intermittent reinforcement pattern that would later make her vulnerable to similar dynamics. When Clarence occasionally returned with promises, young Billie learned to associate male attention with unpredictability. Sadie Harris, her mother while loving, was often absent due to work demands. This created an emotional neglect situation where young Billie learned to compete for attention and developed hypervigilant awareness of adult emotional states. Economic instability during her childhood contributed to psychological patterns that influenced adult relationships. The family frequently faced eviction and survival challenges. This chronic stress taught her that security was always temporary. Witnessing her mother's own dysfunctional relationships provided a behavioral model for adult romantic choices. Sadie attracted unreliable, sometimes violent partners. Young Billie observed a pattern where women sacrificed their needs and endured abuse. School experiences added trauma that influenced her relationship patterns. Due to economic instability, she frequently changed schools and had difficulty maintaining friendships. This created social isolation. Religious influences in her childhood also contributed to psychological patterns. The Baltimore community emphasized concepts of suffering as redemptive and women's roles as self-sacrificing caregivers. This complex web of childhood experiences created complex PTSD, a condition where multiple traumas create pervasive emotional dysregulation and relationship difficulties. When the Monroe relationship ended in 1943 after 2 years of increasing abuse and financial exploitation, friends hoped Billie would learn from the experience and choose a more stable partner next time. Instead, she almost immediately became involved with Joe Guy, a trumpet player who shared many of Monroe's worst characteristics. Guy was also involved with drugs, displayed controlling behavior, and showed primary interest in her money rather than genuine affection. This rapid progression from one toxic relationship to another demonstrated how trauma bonding works. Rather than avoiding painful relationships, trauma survivors often seek them out because they provide a familiar emotional landscape. The Joe Guy relationship lasted from 1943 to 1947 and represented an escalation in destructive patterns rather than improvement. Guy's musical background initially suggested potential for a healthier partnership based on shared artistic interests, but his personal problems proved even more severe than Monroe's. His heroin addiction was more advanced, his financial demands more aggressive, and his emotional manipulation more sophisticated. During this period, Billie's own drug use escalated dramatically. Her performance quality began declining, and her career trajectory shifted from rising star to troubled artist, whose personal problems overshadowed her musical genius. This relationship was particularly damaging because Guy understood the music industry intimately and used this knowledge to sabotage her career advancement. He discouraged her from working with certain musicians who might provide positive influence, promoted collaborations with other addicted artists who reinforced destructive lifestyle, and actively interfered with recording sessions when she attempted to assert creative independence. This professional sabotage combined with personal abuse created a comprehensive control system that isolated her from potential support networks. Psychological analysis of the Guy relationship reveals sophisticated manipulation techniques that trauma survivors find particularly difficult to resist. He alternated between excessive romantic attention during periods when she threatened to leave and cold indifference when she showed signs of independence. This intermittent reinforcement schedule creates powerful psychological addiction beyond chemical dependency. The victim never knows when the next moment of affection will come, creating constant anxiety and desperate attempts to please the abuser. The most devastating aspect of these relationships was how they confirmed Billie's deeply held beliefs about her own worthiness and expectations for love. Childhood trauma had created an internal voice that constantly whispered she deserved punishment, couldn't trust her own judgment, and needed to earn affection through suffering. Abusive partners didn't create these beliefs, they exploited existing psychological vulnerabilities that childhood experiences had already established. After the Guy relationship ended badly in 1947, the pattern was briefly interrupted when Billie began working with Levy, a man who initially appeared different from previous partners. Levy presented himself as a serious business manager with connections throughout the entertainment industry. He claimed romantic interest was secondary to professional relationship and emphasized his ability to restore her career and finances. This approach appealed to Billie because it addressed two primary vulnerabilities simultaneously: the need for male validation and desperate desire to regain professional stability. Initially, the Levy relationship seemed like a promising improvement over previous destructive patterns. He organized successful recording sessions, negotiated favorable performance contracts, and appeared genuinely interested in her artistic development. For several months, Billie experienced what felt like a healthy partnership where romantic affection combined with professional support. This period of relative stability allowed her to reduce drug use temporarily and begin repairing some damaged relationships within the jazz community. However, Levy's true nature gradually emerged as the relationship progressed. His business management proved to be an elaborate scheme for gaining control over her earnings and career decisions. Rather than working for her interests, he systematically diverted funds to his own accounts while creating financial dependency that made leaving the relationship increasingly difficult. When she began questioning his financial management, familiar patterns of emotional manipulation and intimidation returned. The Levy psychological approach was more sophisticated than previous partners because he understood her professional aspirations and used them as additional control mechanisms. He convinced her that her career couldn't survive without his management and that other industry professionals viewed her as an unstable liability. This professional gaslighting combined with romantic manipulation created a comprehensive control system that addressed both emotional and practical vulnerabilities. This relationship also revealed how trauma bonding works at a neurochemical level. When abusive partners provide occasional moments of genuine affection or support, the brain releases dopamine and oxytocin in response to relief from stress. This creates a literal addiction to relationship dynamics where pain followed by relief becomes the preferred emotional state. For Billie, stable relationships felt boring and unfamiliar because they didn't trigger these intense neurochemical responses. Scientific understanding of trauma bonding involves complex interaction between stress hormones and pleasure neurotransmitters. During periods of abuse, the body releases cortisol and adrenaline. When the abusive partner shows affection, stress hormones drop while the brain floods with dopamine. This neurochemical pattern is particularly powerful for trauma survivors because their baseline stress levels are already elevated. Research shows unpredictable intermittent reinforcement creates the strongest behavioral conditioning possible. For Billie Holiday, this meant healthy relationships felt less rewarding neurochemically than toxic relationships. Her brain associated love with struggle. Stable partners who offered reliable affection didn't trigger the same neurochemical rewards. This conditioning explains why she couldn't simply choose healthier partners despite understanding destructive patterns. When she encountered potential partners who triggered familiar stress responses, her brain interpreted this as romantic possibility. Withdrawal symptoms from trauma-bonded relationships mirrored drug addiction. When relationships ended, she experienced not just emotional pain but physical symptoms. This withdrawal was so uncomfortable that reuniting with the toxic partner provided immediate relief. Modern neuroscience reveals repeated trauma bonding creates lasting brain structure changes. Recovery requires neuroplasticity healing where healthier neural pathways must be strengthened. Understanding the neurochemical basis provides a compassionate framework for analyzing her behavior. Rather than moral failing, her attraction to abusive partners represented a logical response of a trauma-conditioned brain. The final major relationship with McKay represented the culmination of all previous destructive patterns while adding new elements that made escape even more difficult. McKay married her in 1957 during a period of particular vulnerability when her health was declining due to years of drug abuse and her career was suffering from legal problems and industry backlash. Marriage provided a veneer of respectability and stability that both desperately needed, but the underlying dynamics remained fundamentally unchanged. The McKay relationship occurred during the most vulnerable period when multiple factors converged. Her physical health was severely compromised, career prospects diminished, and financial resources depleted by legal fees. This context made McKay's approach as a savior figure particularly effective. McKay distinguished himself from previous partners through his willingness to enable her addiction while maintaining a facade of concern for her welfare. He controlled her drug supply and used it as a reward and punishment system for behavior management. When she complied with his demands, drugs were readily available. When she showed signs of independence or resistance, he would restrict access and allow her to experience withdrawal symptoms until she submitted to his control. This drug-based control system represented sophisticated abuse, combining physical dependency with emotional manipulation. Unlike previous partners who introduced her to drugs, McKay encountered her when addiction was already established. McKay's public persona as a devoted husband provided perfect cover for exploitation. To outside observers, he appeared to be making sacrifices to support her. This public narrative made it difficult for her to seek help. Marriage created legal complications previous relationships hadn't involved. As husband, McKay gained automatic rights to make medical and financial decisions, allowing him to control access to treatment and resources. During the final years, the pattern of control became total as her health declined. McKay's management extended to controlling her diet, medication, social contacts, and basic personal decisions. The most tragic aspect was timing. It prevented any period of recovery before her death. Unlike previous relationships where she maintained some professional success, the final marriage coincided with complete collapse. Throughout all these relationships, well-meaning friends and professional associates attempted interventions, offering alternative support systems and healthier relationship options. Several prominent musicians expressed romantic interest and could have provided the stability and respect she deserved. However, these healthier options consistently felt wrong to her because they didn't match internal expectations about love requiring sacrifice and suffering. Modern understanding of trauma bonding explains why logical interventions failed to change her relationship patterns. Trauma survivors often require extensive therapy to identify and modify unconscious beliefs about relationships before they can successfully maintain healthy partnerships. In the 1950s, such psychological understanding didn't exist, and addiction treatment focused primarily on physical withdrawal rather than underlying emotional issues that drove destructive behaviors. Perhaps the most heartbreaking element of her relationship patterns was how they reflected her deepest fear, abandonment, while simultaneously creating conditions that guaranteed abandonment would occur. By choosing partners who were incapable of genuine commitment and love, she ensured that relationships would end badly, confirming her childhood beliefs about being unworthy of lasting affection. This self-fulfilling prophecy aspect of trauma bonding is particularly cruel because it creates an illusion of choice while actually operating through unconscious compulsion. Billie believed she was choosing partners based on attraction and compatibility, but psychological conditioning from childhood experiences actually drove her toward men who would recreate familiar patterns of abandonment and abuse. Each failed relationship reinforced negative beliefs about herself and men, making subsequent healthy relationships even less likely. This downward spiral continued until her death, preventing her from ever experiencing a love relationship that provided genuine support and allowed her artistic genius to flourish without interference from personal chaos. Contemporary psychological research on trauma bonding provides insight into why intervention attempts failed and what might have helped Billie break this destructive cycle. Effective treatment requires addressing underlying trauma through specialized therapy techniques that help survivors identify triggers, develop healthy coping mechanisms, and gradually build capacity for secure attachment relationships. For modern trauma survivors facing similar patterns, Billie Holiday's story serves as both warning and source of hope. Warning because it demonstrates how untreated childhood trauma can destroy even the most talented individuals. Hope because current understanding of psychological healing provides tools that weren't available during her lifetime. Her relationship patterns also illuminate broader social issues that contributed to her vulnerability. As a black woman in the entertainment industry during an era of legal segregation and widespread discrimination, she faced additional stresses and limited support options that made psychological healing even more challenging. Systemic racism, sexism, and lack of mental health resources created an environment where trauma survivors had few alternatives to destructive coping mechanisms. Systemic racism in the entertainment industry created vulnerability factors. Black performers faced systematic exclusion, unequal pay scales, and limited career advancement opportunities. Legal system provided no meaningful protection for black women experiencing domestic violence. Police departments were often hostile to black citizens, particularly those in the entertainment industry. Gender discrimination compounded racial oppression to create a double jeopardy situation where her options were even more limited than other women. Women during this era had few legal rights within marriage, limited access to credit and financial independence, and cultural expectations prioritizing male authority. Mental health resources were essentially non-existent for her demographic during this historical period. Therapy was primarily available to wealthy white patients, and widespread stigma prevented most people from seeking help even when available. For a black woman with addiction problems, professional psychological support simply wasn't an option during that era. Entertainment industry culture itself contributed to normalization of exploitative relationships between performers and management. The industry operated largely without regulation. Contracts often favored management over artists, and personal relationships between performers and their representatives frequently crossed professional boundaries, creating environments where abuse could flourish. Social isolation resulting from her celebrity status and racial dynamics also contributed to her vulnerability. She moved in circles where drug use was normalized and where other participants often had their own addiction problems and chaotic personal lives. This meant her social network consisted largely of people who couldn't provide stable support or realistic perspective on healthy relationships, making escape from toxic patterns even more difficult and creating cycles of mutual enablement within her peer group. Economic instability endemic to performing careers, particularly for black artists during this era, created chronic stress and financial dependency that made leaving toxic relationships seem impossible. Her income was unpredictable and often controlled by managers and partners, making independent financial planning extremely difficult. This economic vulnerability meant romantic relationships often functioned as survival strategy rather than genuine choice, trapping her in cycles of dependency that extended far beyond emotional attachment. Cultural messaging around black women's roles and worth during this era also influenced her relationship expectations and choices significantly. Society portrayed black women as inherently strong, capable of enduring hardship and responsible for supporting others regardless of personal cost. This cultural narrative discouraged seeking help, normalized suffering, and suggested independence was selfish behavior. Religious influences prevalent in the black community during this era emphasized forgiveness, endurance, and women's roles as suffering servants who must sacrifice for others. While these cultural values provided strength and resilience in many contexts, they also could be manipulated by abusive partners who used guilt and religious language to justify exploitation and discourage resistance from their victims. Understanding this social context doesn't excuse abusive partners or minimize her personal responsibility for choices, but it does provide a fuller picture of factors that contributed to tragic patterns. Her story demonstrates how individual psychological healing requires both personal work and supportive social environment that validates worthiness and provides practical assistance for positive change. Legacy of her destructive relationships extends beyond personal tragedy to broader cultural impact on society. Her music, created partly in response to emotional pain from these relationships, captures universal human experiences of love, loss, and betrayal with unprecedented authenticity and emotional depth. This artistic transformation of personal suffering into transcendent art represents her greatest triumph over trauma bonding patterns that otherwise destroyed her life completely. If you enjoyed this video and are curious about other legendary artists' psychological struggles, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Next week we'll explain Nina Simone's bipolar disorder's impact on her career and how mental health stigma affected artistic geniuses with detailed analysis. Tell me in the comments, did you think childhood trauma could dramatically affect adult relationships this much, or are personal choice and willpower more important factors?